Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci. I'm really excited today because we're going to be exploring a topic that I've been wanting to look at for a long time with you, and I think it's a topic that not a lot of people really pay a lot of attention to, but I think it's of extreme importance when we consider the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, and especially when we look at how the assassination actually took place. And it all starts on a airplane flight from Rome, Italy to Dallas, Texas in the first 2 weeks of November 1963. On that flight was William K. Harvey, a name that you might be familiar with. And at the time, he was the CIA station chief in Rome. What he did when he got to Dallas will interact incredibly well with things that we're familiar with people like Lee Bowers, who was the supervisor of the railroad yards in Dealey Plaza during the assassination, and the dark-complected man who was next to the umbrella man in Dealey Plaza, and what would happen after the second Oswald was arrested and then let go, shortly after the first Oswald was arrested in the Texas theater. All of those things interact, and they interact really, really tightly. And I know it sounds a little crazy, but let's dive right in, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. In order to understand the importance of the appearance of William K. Harvey in Dallas in the first 2 weeks of November 1963, we have to explore who William K. Harvey was. Actually, he was an FBI agent from 1940 to 1947, and then he joined the CIA when that organization was established, and he became head of what was known as Staff D, and that was the electronic surveillance branch of the clandestine services. So he was involved in electronic surveillance. From 1952 to 1960, Harvey was in West Berlin and he led an operation to spy on the Soviet communication channels of the Soviet sector in Berlin. And he led an effort to dig a tunnel in order to tap into those communication channels. So once again, he's very, very involved in surveillance. After Berlin, William K. Harvey becomes the head of ZR Rifle, which is the CIA operative arm of the assassination or overthrow of foreign political leaders. And Harvey is known as the agent that really overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. So he has no compunction against assassination or overthrow of political leaders. From there, he gets sent to Operation Mongoose in Miami, which is operating out of Miami, which is charged with the overthrow or the assassination of President Fidel Castro. Now, Harvey has organized crime contacts, and he elicits the help of Santo Trafficante, Sam Giancana, John Roselli, and others in assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. Now, by this time, Harvey is so out of control. He's a very heavy drinker, we have to understand also. But he's at this point so out of control and so flushed with power that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I kid you not, he actually sends raiding parties into Cuba to try to sink Soviet shipping. He's trying to undermine President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sending raiding parties into Cuba. It's absolutely unbelievable. Well, Robert Kennedy finds out about this. Both Kennedys know about it. Robert Kennedy finds out, and he kind of banishes William K. Harvey to Rome to stay until he retires. Robert Kennedy wants to fire him, but he's kind of talked into letting him just stay in Rome until he retires. So it's very, very interesting that it will be William K. Harvey, this guy who is exceedingly good with surveillance, with eavesdropping, with communications, and assassinations, that shows up in the first 2 weeks of Dallas in November of 1963. Okay, so now let's start tying in William K. Harvey's appearance in Dallas with what happened during the assassination. And we go first to Lee Bowers. Lee Bowers, as you know, was the railroad supervisor. He was located in a railroad tower above the railroad yards and the parking lot just beyond the stockade fence in Dealey Plaza. He saw three cars in the 20 minutes or so before the assassination drive through individually and very slowly drive around the parking lot like they were doing surveillance. The second car, he noticed that the driver had either a radio microphone or some kind of a telephone setup in his hand. And Bowers said he was driving with one hand and talking into the microphone with the other hand. Then we move now to the dark complected man in Dealey Plaza. After the assassination took place, he was seen sitting next to the umbrella man. But what was he doing? He was talking on a military grade radio. Who was he talking to? Who was the person that was driving through the parking lot that Lee Bowers talking to? And our third example takes place just after the arrest of the second Oswald in the Texas Theater, who was taken out the back door and driven away. Well, just about 5 blocks later, that person who was arrested, who looks like a splitting image of Lee Oswald, could be his twin, according to the people who saw him arrested. Well, he shows up in a red Ford Falcon and he's speeding back and forth. And it looks kind of weird to a mechanic named T.F. White, who's working at Mac Pate's garage. And then when he sees this red Falcon pull into the El Chico restaurant parking lot, Mr. White decides to come across the street and take a look more closely. The car speeds away, but White gets the license plate and writes it down. He tells his boss, who tells a reporter named Wes Wise, who will later become the mayor of Dallas, that that license plate actually belonged to a 1957 blue Plymouth. And it was registered to a man named Carl Mathers, who works at Collins Radio. And we find out that Carl Mathers is one really interesting gentleman. We find out that his family is very close with the family of J.D. Tippit, who has just been murdered. And within an hour, Carl Mathers' family is over at the Tippit's home, and they are comforting Officer Tippit's widow. More importantly, perhaps, is the fact that Carl Mathers works often on LBJ's Air Force Two, and he does that out of Washington, D.C. So he's back and forth. So all of a sudden, Collins Radio begins to be very, very important in our story. In the 1960s, Collins Radio was at the forefront of radio and aviation technology, known for its high-quality, precision equipment used in amateur radio, professional broadcasts, and especially military communications and the space race. And as part of those military applications, it was Collins Radio that was the go-to corporation for the CIA. Collins Radio provided nearly all of the eavesdropping, communications, microphone, and even space-based communications at that time in 1963 for both the military and the CIA. Well, where was Collins Radio located? Well, it was located just in the north suburbs of Dallas, Texas. That's right, just 13 or 14 miles away from Dealey Plaza sat the complex of Collins Radio. And I firmly believe that it was at Collins Radio that the communication center for the assassination of President Kennedy was established and was overseen by William K. Harvey during his trip in the first 2 weeks of November of 1963. Why was a communications command center needed during the assassination of President Kennedy? Well, for a multitude of reasons. Number one, Lee Oswald was being set up as a patsy in the murder of President Kennedy. The conspirators wanted those shots to look like they came from the Texas School Book Depository. So the sequence of shots was very important for the conspirators. Secondly, there could be a sinking of shots during the assassination. And what I mean by that is that if two or more shots could have been fired at roughly the same time, it could have thrown the bystanders off in the number of shots that they thought they heard. Next, there is the fact that a lot of variables could happen in any assassination. For example, suppose there was a police presence in the parking lot behind the stockade fence at the last minute. Or perhaps the bubble could have been put on President Kennedy's car at the last minute after a warning of conspiracy. And I believe the dark complected man and the umbrella man come into focus clearly here. What if President Kennedy had received a mortal head wound before he reached the Knoll area? Would the dark complected man and the umbrella man given different signals, which would have been relayed so that no shot would have come from the Knoll? Who knows? Perhaps. And I think there's a fourth good example of how a communications command center came into play during the JFK assassination. If you've watched some of my other videos, you may have seen my presentation on Sergeant Robert Vincent, who was in Washington, D.C., found himself on a CIA plane as the only passenger that was on its way to Colorado, but got diverted at exactly 12:30 to go to Dallas, where it supposedly picked up a Lee Oswald lookalike. Well, if the shots rang out at 12:29 in Dealey Plaza and the announcement came over the PA system on that flight at 12:30, that's only 1 minute away. That's only 1 minute that has progressed from the shooting to that announcement. Well, how could that be? The only way it could be is if that CIA plane that Sergeant Vincent was on was tied in to that command center at Collins Radio just north of Dallas, Texas. So my point with all of this is that I think William K. Harvey of the CIA, who was so used to both communications, surveillance, eavesdropping, microphones, the whole communications network, satellite, everything in 1963. Plus, he was in charge of assassinations. He was obviously in charge of the assassination of Fidel Castro. He had the connections with organized crime. I believe he was in Dallas in the first 2 weeks of November 1963, not to check out Dealey Plaza, but to set up a communications command operation at Collins Radio in Richardson, Texas. And I think the fact that we have obvious examples of people on military grade radios, both the dark complected man, the man in the car that Lee Bowers saw, and other examples, the Carl Mathers situation where he actually worked for Collins Radio, but his car was seen in the escape of the second Lee Oswald from the Texas School Book Depository. They're all examples. I believe that there had to be a command center. There had to be people in charge, not only to take control of the assassination if it went as planned, but also, maybe more importantly, to really be able to react if things didn't go as planned. It's really interesting, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.